Hi, everyone, and welcome to Wholehearted Parenting. Today, we are here with Amy White. Amy is an intuitive coach, medium, and international best-selling author who transitioned out of corporate America after experiencing helping her son through a terrifying mental health crisis. And Amy has written a book called Closer to Paradise, A Mother's Journey Through Crisis and Healing. So welcome, Amy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We are so grateful to have you here. I really feel like part of me could name this speaker series, the truth about the messiness of raising teens, because that is what has become so important, is that instead of people feeling like they're alone struggling with their experience, that we can just honestly share our stories of how hard it is and recognize that, of course, there are moments of joy and pride there, but there is devastation and heartbreak. So, Amy, thank you so much for joining us here.
Yeah. Thanks for allowing me to share my story.
Yeah. So maybe we'll rewind a number of years when you were struggling with your teen. Just start at a place that makes sense for the beginning of your story.
So, yeah, it really was a situation that happened pretty quickly. You know, my son was approaching his 16th birthday, and over the summer, heading into the school year, we started to notice a change in his personality. He started the year very inspired and excited to make it his best year yet. And within a couple of months, he was getting darker and more depressed and more isolating. And we weren't I wasn't really sure what to do to help him sort of right him, self back on that path he had started on just a couple of months before. In the midst of all of it, he had approached me and said he wanted to start taking an antidepressant, which we thought was a little bit out of the blue. And I had somewhat thought, maybe it's just a bit of a normal teenage angst. So I was trying not to be overly concerned about it. But shortly after he started the antidepressant, everything started to spiral out of control. And before we knew it, we were in the psychiatric emergency department of our local hospital, and really realized how critical a situation he was in. Yeah. And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep telling us your story.
Okay. But that night that we ended up in the emergency room launched me on a journey that lasted almost 2 years of learning how to advocate for my son, learning how to face the stigma, the shame, and the blame that comes with having a child with mental health challenges. We ended up having to, put him into some residential programs at one point. There was a suicide attempt in the middle of all of this, and our insurance company was fighting us the whole way for the services that he needed. So it was a situation that not only did I have to really reach inside and find the strength to be a caregiver for my son in a way that I had never had to be before, nor had I any background in that. I also had to reach deep inside and face some of my own stories and my own belief systems about what it meant to be an advocate, what it meant to take care of myself in the midst of crisis. Was I selfish in caring for myself and putting my oxygen mask on first before I took care of, my son's needs? And it took almost the same length of time as he was going through his process for me to go through my process to realize all of the things that I had within me to really transform because of the experience.
Incredible. An incredible opportunity, because I know that these things have the potential to make us feel like we are crumbling, and it can do that too, but also that you learned and had this sense of healing alongside your son is just so incredible. Can you peel back some of the layers of of how all of those different things kind of washed over you and some of those insights that you had, because I know that's a huge process.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I will be the first to admit that when it all started, the one thing I wanted to do more than anything was like climb in bed and pull the covers over my head and just, batten down the hatches and wait for it to be over. It was scary. It was such an unknown that it was overwhelming, and it was all consuming. It really took over a lot of my space in my own brain of what did I do wrong? How did I cause this? What could I have done differently? Oh, there was that time I yelled at him when he threw a rock, and now, did that, contribute to this? And so there was so much of that self-blame and self-judgment. And as I said a few minutes ago, I was getting it also from the external, not only from my own thought processes, but from people who, had opinions about what was going on and how this had happened. And then even within the medical community, the people who were assigned to take care of my son were often pointing the finger as well, as me as a parent. And maybe if I hadn't traveled so much when I was, when he was young and I was working, maybe then things would have been different. So I was faced with all of this. And it's very easy when you're both you have the message internally that you've done something wrong, and then you're hearing it externally to look and say, wow, I must really be the root cause of this. And it took me a couple of months of really literally just doing what I needed to do to take care of him before I started to realize this is not going to just go away overnight. And I need to be able to really look at, how do I best support my son? And what does that look like? And some of that for me was, disregarding both the talk, track I had in my mind, as well as the feedback I was getting from other people, and saying whether I was or wasn't the root of my son's issues, he needs support. And I need to make sure that I'm stepping up and getting him everything he needs regardless. And in that, recognizing that I had to take care of me first in order to make sure that he was well taken care of. And so for me, that meant I needed to be getting exercise, and I needed to be eating well, and I needed to be getting good sleep. I needed to turn my phone off and all my notifications off for hours at a time, just to get that break, that respite from the constant barrage of phone calls and insurance meetings and team meetings and everything that was required for the care of my son at that time. So that made me start to realize that I had been carrying around these belief systems about who I was and how strong I was and how good of a parent I was, because I was letting a lot of different stories impact the truth of who I was. And I realized through it, I was a really good parent. I am still a really good parent. But up until that time, I wasn't perfect, but none of us are. But I had really put that parenting, being a parent, as a priority, and being an active parent. I was involved. I was, encouraged conversation with my children. I was at every event, and that's really important. And it was really important for me to see that in the midst of such a tumultuous experience, and especially one that, as I said, my old belief system wanted to keep pointing the finger back at me. And sure, if it was all my problem, then I could fix it, right? But it doesn't always, work that way. In fact, it often does not.
I'm grateful that you were able to describe that there is no such thing as a perfect parent, but that you were involved and engaged. And, the way you described your experience of your son and how quickly it went into a crisis situation, and you were there experiencing that. And I'm so grateful that the people watching can hear that message, because mental health if there was a magic cure or a way we could prevent our children from struggling with their mental health, of course we would do that for them. But it is beyond our capacity to be able to, manage and contain that.
Mm-hmm.
The best we can do is what you just described, which is being active, engaged, noticing when their request seems out of the blue or things are a little off. And I'm grateful that you could describe those really key moments, because that's as good as it gets. And I know that can sometimes put parents into that spin of fear that, really, that's all I can do. What do you do? What strategies have you developed, or what do you help people recognize when they are spinning into that fear place to really pull them back?
Well, I think what's really important is that we have to realize that our children are here to have their own experience and to have their own journey. We're caretakers of these beautiful beings that we were blessed with in our lives, but we're not the driver of their lives, and we don't control their lives, and we can't be there to stop them from falling or stop them from having an experience. And I think one of the things that was so empowering for me, and I've been able to actually have this conversation with my son, after the crisis was over and he and I healed our relationship, was that by allowing him to feel as though he had some say in what was happening to him and some choices that he could make along the way, it felt very empowering, because he realized that I trusted that he had this journey on his own, and I wasn't trying to. Though in the middle of the crisis, he would have said that I was trying to manipulate his experience. I actually was stepping back and allowing him to have some say in it, and some of his choices during this experience also created the path that he took. Some were harder paths to walk on than others, but it was his journey. And letting that go and realizing for me that there's a higher energy that actually has the oversight of our lives is a big deal. And I think when I work with parents, and because I do advocacy work with parents who are going through similar circumstances, and I say to them, it's really important that your child knows, in whatever capability they can in the moment, that you do actually trust that they know what is good for them, and that they can make some of those choices. And the best we can do, I think parenting is a lot like coaching, pee-wee soccer. It's redirect. It's and it's not necessarily demanding certain steps be taken, but hey, keep your eye on the ball. Hey, there goes the ball. Hey, maintain your position. Are really things that are important and also empowering. We don't want to disempower our children, because then they turn out to be disempowered adults, and that doesn't serve anyone, especially the greater good.
Now, I love that you said, believing that there's some sort of bigger picture at play. Psychologists have known a lot about resilience since the 1970s, but one of the newer things that has come to the fore in the world of psychology is recognizing that if people can see that their life is a small piece connected to something much larger, whether we call that something much larger, the interconnection of the ecosystems or the divine, God, whatever the belief system is, it doesn't matter the logistics of what the belief is, but just knowing that there is something much bigger that is at play, I think is so great, because it gives us that lift that we can release it and have somewhere to let it go to when we need to surrender.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that as people, whether parents or in other areas, whether the parenting or in other areas of our lives, is that when we feel like we have 100% responsibility, we're often not able to get out of the way and let things unfold in a way that's actually with more ease and grace. Often when we're trying to drive everything and control everything, we create more painful experiences for ourselves. And I think that we can also do that with our children. And I can say that because I did that for lots of years. I really tried to make sure that my kids didn't experience the painful things in their lives that I experienced in my life growing up. And it's so interesting when you realize that often as parents, when we try to influence their the children's experience, is that we're not necessarily looking at what they need, but we're looking at what we need, what we needed, what we missed growing up. And this crisis with my son really brought a lot of that to the forefront too. And I realized, wow, maybe I have been trying to fill some of my own healing needs with giving to my children in a way that it was good, but it wasn't meeting their needs. And this really allowed me to step back and say, okay, what does my son need? And how can I give him that, even if it's not something that I, myself would have needed in the same situation.
Mm-hmm. I love that you described, kind of putting your own oxygen mask on first and working through getting over feeling like that was selfish to do, because there was something there that you recognized that your son needed from you that you could only give him if you took care of yourself. Can you describe what some of those qualities are
Yeah.
that you felt like were so important that required you to take care of yourself in order so you could be that for your son?
Yeah, I think the big one was being present. If I was well rested and well fed and had given myself the space to breathe, even if it was just for 5 minutes, during the course of the day, I then could be more present. And in the case of this crisis, he needed presence from me. Circling back to what we were just talking about. In those moments, I wasn't trying to figure out how to fix it. I was just trying to be there for him. And some of it was in the line of his fire. I mean, he was very angry at me. He was angry that he was, had to be hospitalized or had to be, in a residential treatment facility. And had I not been caring for myself as well as I was, I may have engaged in it as an argument or gotten defensive, and that would have made things worse. But the more that I was able to be present, the more I was able to really look at it from a broader lens and say, okay, what he's saying in anger may not be truth, but in this moment it's his truth. And I don't have to defend it or tell him his truth is wrong. I just need to be here to say, look, I'm here. I'm here to talk about this. I'm here to hear you, even if we can't have a discussion about it. And that was really important. When I work with, clients from an advocacy perspective, many times what I hear is, there's no time. How do I find time to take care of myself? And some of the things that I found going through it was that respite could have been sitting in the car for 5 extra minutes after I got to, a meeting or a treatment center, with him, or getting home from something, and just turn the car off and sit in silence for 5 minutes, not surfing on my phone, not listening to the radio, just giving myself that 5 minutes. It is amazing how recharging that little tiny bit of time is. It doesn't mean that you go away for the weekend and, go to retreat or do that. If you can, it's great. I did get to a point in the middle of my son's experience where I knew he was, as safe as he could be in a facility. And I did go away for a weekend just to really recharge my batteries. But the little tiny moments of, taking a walk or sitting in the car, or for me, it was yoga. Yoga ended up being my absolute savior through it, because for 1 hour, a couple of times a week, I could turn off my phone and sort of be unreachable, and just be in that space of taking care of me. And the more that I did that, the more I felt like I showed up and was present. And I was also very clear on what things I needed to advocate for and what things I needed to sort of let unfold. And when you're in a place of being burned out from it, you don't always have that clear thought process.
Hmm. And I imagine when you're taking those few moments or when you're on the yoga mat, it can be overwhelming, all the emotions that you can feel, because you can't always feel them in the moment. Sometimes they are stored up for another more private time. How did you keep coming back to those quiet moments, those yoga experiences, knowing that that's probably the time when it's all going to pour out of you? I know sometimes that's why people don't want to take the time, because they don't want to have that experience. So tell us about how you actually trusted that you could allow the emotions to come.
Well, and that's a great question, because I spent a number of my yoga classes in corpse pose, sobbing, and just I was blessed to be part of an amazing yoga community that just allowed me the space to do that. Whether I was moving on my mat or laying on my mat in tears, and it was honored. They honored it. They created the safe space for me to be able to let down. And I think same for, being able to take some moments in the car. I have this thing that I talk about in my book, and I talk about in a lot of my work, which I call car screaming. And, and basically, I would be driving on the freeway, back and forth between wherever my son was being hospitalized at the time, with whatever loud, crazy music that I could. And I would just scream along with it. And at some points it would just be like primal scream, from my core. And what's beautiful is, if you notice when you're driving down the freeway, nobody's looking, so it's this really safe place to kind of let some of that out in a way that, you couldn't do it, in your home or outside of your home, without people thinking that maybe, there was something actually very wrong. But to me, those were the two best ways for me to find the space to let out the emotion, and being able to do that and feeling safe enough to do that, again, allowed me to be more present in those moments where I needed to be there for my son.
I hope that your stories will help our viewers give themselves the permission to do whatever they need to do. If that means crying in a yoga class, or just holding the space while someone else does that, or screaming in the car. Those are such great, clear examples of what taking care of our emotional body really can look like, that sometimes we would think that's strange, people will judge me, I don't want to do it. But just knowing that that's what it takes is so freeing. So thank you for sharing those moments with us, because they're so clear and so doable and so necessary. And I just already can feel the lightness of people hearing that car screaming is okay. You should be doing some car screaming.
Yeah.
And for me, for a while with a toddler, it was stomping. Both she and I did some stomping. Like, you got to discharge some of this feeling and find a safe way to do it that nobody's getting hurt, and to just have that process is incredible. Now, before our time is over, we're getting near the end here, I really want to talk about something you mentioned when we spoke on the phone about the stigma of mental health concerns. Our teenager breaks their arm, of course, we're going to hospital. There may be a few questions as to how did this arm get broken, and then you put a cast on and move through it. And yet in the world of mental health, which is mental health is something that we all need to have on our radar. It can affect people who are young, a higher incidence of mental health concerns for teens because of the chemistry of their brains and their bodies. And yet there is so much stigma around mental health concerns, as if there is a fault to us. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how your experience has been facing that stigma, and now what your advocacy looks like to help people work through that.
Yeah, I before this experience, I did not have a lot of firsthand experience with mental health. There had been some depression in my family and some of that, but nothing of this magnitude. And so I have to be honest, the stigma surprised me. It surprised me, especially, as I said a little while ago, when I was actually experiencing that stigma from within the medical community. it itself, because I kept thinking, wow, these are the people who are chartered with taking care of my son, and yet they are more, focused on finding fault in someone instead of looking at what is happening for him physically, mentally, emotionally. I when I first started to realize that I needed to, step up and take care of myself. And one of the things that I did was I started to ask around to people who I was working with, I had an acupuncturist I was working with, I was working with a chiropractor, and I said, this is what I'm experiencing. Do you know anyone else who's going through this? And my acupuncturist came back and said, I actually have a client who has a very similar experience as you. Let me speak to her and see if she's willing to have a cup of coffee with you. Because that's all I wanted. I wanted to talk, like sit across the table with somebody who experienced the same thing as I did, just to know, okay, I'm not alone in this. And so a week later, I had gone back to an appointment and I said, did you have a chance to speak to your client? And she said, I did. And the client is not willing to have coffee with you. And I was just floored. And I said, well, why? And she said, and this sticks with me. She said, no one knows what's going on with her son except for her husband, and their doctor. And I thought, wow, if that doesn't speak volumes for what we're doing as parents trying to support our children through this without any support, without any external support. Now, there are agencies and things that you can get involved with, but for me, it didn't seem to fit in. I really wanted that one-to-one connection with another parent who was experiencing the same thing. But at that moment, I realized how deep the stigma was. That this woman, this mother, wasn't even reaching out to her close circle of friends who was creating that space for her to heal, to mourn, to grieve, to, just offer a shoulder. And that's really one of the things I realized at that moment. If I couldn't find what I was looking for, I needed to build it. And that's why I started writing my blog. And that's why I started doing advocacy work, because my story doesn't make me unique, but my ability to create space for other people to know that they're not alone is pretty unique in that space right now. And I love that there are other people out there doing this work too. And there's a lot of need for it. And that's, to me, that I realized that as scary as the stigma was, it was more important for me to be able to call it into the light and to bring awareness to the fact that this is real. This isn't just a made up thing. And unfortunately, pop culture and the media and society paints a picture of mental health that's scary, and that's not necessarily accurate. And that just adds to the stigma, and that keeps people silent.
Yes. From my own experience on the periphery of this as a high school teacher, I had one semester where two of my students, so I had multiple classes, but of one class, 40 students, two of those students were hospitalized for their mental health for 30 days. And I was floored by that, recognizing that, and I had seen these students every day leading up to it. And I'd had conversations with them, and I knew there was some struggle there, but I could have equally have decided, recognized that there were similar struggles among 15 other of those students. There's nothing in my experience with them that would have made me register that they, compared to their peers, were struggling to the extent that they needed to be hospitalized. Mm-hmm. And that was frightening to me. And I was grateful that they had found the people. In the course of a busy classroom of 40, I'm not going to be the one that they're necessarily going to lean on for that. And I was so grateful that they had leaned into someone so they could find the support that they needed. But also knowing that after those 30 days are over, there are limits to how much support. And then there's the re-entry into the classroom, questions about where they've been, questions about how do we treat this person now? How do we respond to them? What do we look for? And now we're on high alert.
Yeah.
And so knowing that, especially with mental health, then it's not like a broken arm. Then there is this high attunement to, now how do we have to proceed with this, and what do we have to look for now? Can you
Mhm.
give us a brief update as to how your son is doing now?
Yes, absolutely. He is doing really well. It took him probably another 18 months or more after his last hospitalization to really start to feel himself like he was on the path to his own recovery. Um, and during that time period, he and I had a very tough relationship. He was very angry with me, as I'd said earlier, about some of the decisions that I had to make in the course of his treatment. And about 12 months later, he and I started to heal our relationship. And I had moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And then shortly thereafter, he came out to live with me. And he's doing very well. He's a manager at a retail location, and he's really flourishing. So it's good to see that he was able to come through such an experience. And he has a lot of introspection about it, and he has learned a lot about it, and ultimately would like to be able to share his story to
Mm,
young adults who are going through similar circumstances.
incredible. Thank you for sharing how it is now. Um, and I know that a lot of your work now is intuitive work, coaching work. Can you tell us um, the experience you had in terms of using your intuition through your healing journey?
So, yes, my intuition was, I think, really the point that allowed me to take the covers off from over my head and start down the journey. I recognized, I felt very guided that this wasn't how I was going to do this. And it's not to say that it was a right way or a wrong way. And I don't want anyone to feel like I'm judging if they're in the middle of an experience like this and they're still under the covers. I get it. For me, it was the force behind me saying, get up, you need to do your work so that you can do your work going forward, was really powerful. And that to me was a very strong intuitive guidance. And I think that it also helped me throughout, knowing how to address certain things that I hadn't ever faced before. Like when the insurance company was wanting to discharge my son before he was safe to leave the hospital, I felt really guided to do certain things, like write certain letters and send it to certain people. And that all felt like it was my intuitive guidance. Because certainly, as I said, I hadn't been through something like this before. I was really acting primarily on intuition.
Incredible. Yeah, because there's no script for how to handle this.
No.
Just as in everyday things with our children, there's no script for handling it. And the script we used with the older one isn't always going to be the one that we use with the younger one. So
Completely.
I'm grateful that you could articulate that, because I think that sense of trusting ourselves is so powerful when we're in a tailspin trying to figure out this incredibly new and frightening situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that by listening to my intuition and really tuning into it during that time frame was what opened the door for me to be able to do more of that type of work
Mm.
today. So it really
Mm-hmm.
was all connected.
And tell us a little bit about your work today.
So today, I still do advocacy with caregivers who are experiencing, situations with their children, like we've talked about. But a lot of the work that I do is working through intuitive coaching, and I also am a medium, so I do some medium work as well, helping people find a way to not just survive crisis that they've experienced in their life or difficult times that they've experienced in their lives, but to really thrive as a result of it. And I think that was my story in a nutshell, is that I took this experience and decided that I didn't want to just survive it. I wanted to thrive because of it. And I wanted to take that ability to thrive out into the world so that other people could also see that it's possible. When we go through a crisis, we often come to a crossroad where one way is transformation and the other way is sort of self-destruction. And we all get to choose. Sometimes we stay at that crossroad and we don't choose, and we're kind of stuck in our lives. And then sometimes we choose one way or the other. My hope is through my work that I can help the people who are sort of stuck at that crossroad to choose the path to thrive, to really use their experience to influence and inform, finding more joy in their lives, finding more success in their lives. So that's the work that I do today.
Beautiful. And I hope everyone watching hears that as a permission slip to thrive, even in the midst of whatever you're going through.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to connect further with Amy, there's links below us. And Amy, you're giving us a link to the first chapter of your book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yep. So the book is, as you said earlier, is called Closer to Paradise, A Mother's Journey Through Crisis and Healing. And it is basically a memoir of my journey accompanying my son down his path. But it's really solely what we've talked about today. It's from my perspective, what I experienced, what I learned, and how I grew in spite of all of the challenges. So the first chapter gives a good basis for kind of the roller coaster ride of a journey that we go on over the course of this 24 months that the book covers.
Beautiful. Amy, thank you so much for sharing your heart, for sharing your being vulnerable and sharing your story and your experience so that our viewers can catch a glimpse of where they are and what the next step might be for them, wherever they are in their journey. Amy, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you.